It was the kind of cafe that didn't appear in travel guides or roadside reviews. Its paint, once a cheerful yellow, had faded to a pale, peeling shadow of itself. The cracked neon sign hanging above the door hummed faintly, buzzing out its half-hearted announcement, "Open." On good days, the O and P flickered in sync. Today, they didn't. The parking lot was mostly empty, save for a couple of dusty cars and an old pickup truck that looked like it had seen better decades. Inside, the cafe was dimly lit, with sunlight struggling to seep through smudged windows. A ceiling fan turned lazily above, as though it couldn't be bothered to keep up with the summer heat. An older man sat at the counter, alone, except for his coffee and the low hum of a radio playing soft country tunes. The man wasn't dressed to stand out. He wore faded jeans and a plain black t-shirt under a leather jacket that had been broken in by years, not months. The jacket wasn't flashy, but it carried a quiet kind of authority, something you couldn't buy off a store rack. His hair was salt and pepper, neatly combed back, but his face bore the lines of someone who had spent much of his life outdoors. There was a calmness about him, an almost meditative stillness. His eyes, however, told a different story. Sharp, focused, and always moving, they missed nothing, not the shifting shadows of passing cars outside, not the slight crack in his coffee mug, and certainly not the sound of distant engines rumbling down the road. This was Jack Carver. To the casual observer, he was just another retiree, passing the time with a cup of black coffee at a roadside cafe. But to those who truly looked, and not many did, Jack was something else entirely. Jack wasn't the kind of man who talked much. He didn't share stories about his past with strangers or try to impress anyone with tales of glory days. If you asked him where he was from or what he'd done before now, he'd just shrug and say, "Here and there." But the way he carried himself, the straight-backed posture, the measured movements hinted at a life lived on the edge of something important. That day, Jack was content to keep to himself, as usual. The cafe wasn't busy. A young cashier stood behind the counter, her thumbs flying across her phone screen as if her life depended on it. In the kitchen, the cook flipped burgers with the kind of monotony that comes from doing the same thing day in and day out. A middle-aged couple sat in the corner booth, sharing a plate of fries without saying much to each other. Outside, the distant rumble of engines grew louder, cutting through the stillness like a storm on the horizon. Jack didn't turn his head, but his eyes flicked toward the sound. Moments later, 4 motorcycles roared into the parking lot, their riders laughing loudly as they skidded to a stop. The bikers were hard to miss, even in a place like this. They wore matching leather jackets adorned with patches and symbols that seemed designed to intimidate. Chains dangled from their belts, clinking with every step as they swaggered toward the cafe. Their boots stomped against the pavement, and their voices carried even before the door swung open. Inside, the cashier glanced up from her phone, her expression shifting from bored to anxious in an instant. The cook peeked out from the kitchen, then quickly disappeared back into the safety of his grill. The couple in the corner leaned closer to their table, as if trying to become invisible. The bikers pushed through the door, bringing with them the smell of exhaust and cheap beer. They didn't walk in so much as take over the space, their presence filling the small cafe like a rising tide. One of them, a wiry guy with a scar running down his cheek, headed straight for the counter. "Smells like retirement home coffee in here," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. His companions laughed, a harsh, grating sound that seemed to echo off the walls. Jack didn't look up. He sat perfectly still, his hands wrapped around his coffee cup, as if he hadn't noticed the intrusion. "Hey, old man," Scarface called out, leaning against the counter. "You deaf or just ignoring me?" Jack didn't respond. The cashier's eyes darted between Jack and the biker, her hand hovering near the phone as if debating whether to call someone. But who? Out here, on this stretch of road, it wasn't like help would arrive quickly. Scarface smirked, glancing back at his crew. "Looks like Grandpa's too busy with his coffee." Maybe we should help him drink it? The others chuckled, egging him on. Scarface reached for Jack's cup, but before his fingers could touch it, Jack moved. It wasn't a big movement, just a slight shift of his hand to pull the cup closer, but it was enough to stop the biker in his tracks. For a moment, there was silence. The kind of silence that feels heavier than noise. Scarface's grin faltered, replaced by something harder to place. "You've got guts, I'll give you that," he said, his tone darker now. "But guts only get you so far, old man." Jack finally looked up, his eyes meeting the biker's. They weren't angry or scared. They were calm. Too calm. The biker blinked, then shook his head as if trying to dismiss whatever had just passed between them. He turned to his friends. "Let's grab a table. Grandpa here's boring me." The group laughed again, though the sound was less confident this time, and made their way to a booth. Scarface lingered for a moment, still watching Jack, before following the others. The tension in the room eased slightly, but it didn't disappear. The cashier let out a quiet breath, her hands trembling as she set her phone down. The couple in the corner whispered to each other, glancing nervously at the bikers. Jack returned to his coffee, his posture unchanged, his expression unreadable. He wasn't ignoring the bikers, far from it. He was watching, listening, waiting. Because Jack Carver knew something the bikers didn't: storms don't just pass. Sometimes, they break. Jack's gaze returned to the dark surface of his coffee, the steam curling into lazy spirals that seemed to mirror his unhurried demeanor. Outside, the rumble of motorcycles faded into the stillness, but their presence lingered like a storm cloud hanging low on the horizon. At the booth, the bikers sprawled out as though they owned the place. Scarface sat at the head of the table, his long legs stretched across the aisle, blocking the narrow walkway. His companions, an unkempt blonde with a chipped tooth, a heavy-set man with a tattoo crawling up his neck, and a wiry guy who looked too young to belong, snickered and nudged each other, their voices a mix of insults and crude jokes. "Hey, sweetheart," Scarface called to the cashier, slapping the table to punctuate his words. "How about some service? Or are we supposed to starve over here?" The cashier flinched but forced a tight smile. She hesitated for a moment before stepping out from behind the counter, her notepad clutched tightly in her hands. Her sneakers squeaked faintly against the tile as she approached their table. What can I get you?" she asked, her voice small. Scarface leaned back in his seat, grinning as he looked her up and down. "How about a smile for starters?" The other bikers laughed, their voices grating against the quiet. The cashier's face flushed red, but she managed a forced grin that didn't quite reach her eyes. "There you go," Scarface said, chuckling. "See? Wasn't so hard, was it?" Jack's grip on his coffee mug tightened slightly. His eyes flicked toward the bikers, then back to the cashier. She was young, barely out of her teens by the look of her, and clearly in over her head. Her trembling hands betrayed her despite her efforts to maintain composure. As she scribbled down their order, the blonde biker reached out, plucking the pen from her fingers. "What's your name, sweetheart?" he asked, twirling the pen between his fingers. "Emma," she said softly, not meeting his eyes. "Well, Emma," the blonde said, leaning closer, "how about you sit with us for a while? Take a load off." I can't," she stammered, glancing over her shoulder toward the cook, who was nowhere to be seen. Scarface's grin widened. "Sure you can. Boss won't mind." "What's he gonna do, fire you?" Emma's eyes darted to Jack, as if hoping he might say something, do something. But Jack remained still, his expression unreadable. Scarface caught the look and followed her gaze. His smile twisted into something colder. "What's the matter? You think Grandpa over there's gonna save you?" The table erupted in laughter, and Jack felt the weight of their attention shift toward him. Slowly, Deliberately, he set his coffee cup down, the soft clink of ceramic against the counter cutting through the noise like a blade. He didn't turn around. He didn't need to. The room seemed to shrink as the bikers fell quiet, their laughter trailing off into uneasy murmurs. Scarface narrowed his eyes, his grin faltering. "You got something to say, old man?" Jack's voice, when it came, was low and steady. She said no. The simplicity of the statement hung in the air, stark and undeniable. For a moment, no one moved. Then Scarface pushed himself up from the booth, his chair scraping loudly against the tile. He crossed the room in slow, deliberate steps, his boots echoing in the sudden silence. Well, he said, stopping a few feet from Jack. "Looks like Grandpa's got a little fight in him after all." Jack turned his head slightly, just enough to meet Scarface's gaze. His eyes were calm, unflinching, and as cold as steel. "I'm just here for my coffee," Jack said evenly. Scarface smirked, but there was a flicker of uncertainty behind his eyes. "Yeah? Well, maybe you should finish it and move along. This isn't your fight." Jack held his gaze for a long moment, then turned back to his coffee. "Not yet," he said quietly. Scarface stiffened, his hands curling into fists. Behind him, the other bikers watched with tense anticipation, their earlier bravado replaced with something closer to unease. Emma took a step back, her notepad clutched to her chest. "Please," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Just leave him alone." Scarface didn't respond. He was too busy staring at Jack, trying to gauge whether the old man was a threat or just another washed-up relic. After a beat, he barked out a laugh and turned back toward his table. "Crazy old coot," he muttered. "Not worth the trouble." The tension in the room eased, but only slightly. The bikers returned to their booth, their laughter forced and hollow. Emma quickly retreated behind the counter, her hands shaking as she poured a fresh pot of coffee. Jack remained at the counter, his posture as steady as ever. He lifted his coffee cup and took another sip, as though nothing had happened. But something had. The bikers' laughter grew louder, more aggressive, as they tried to reclaim the dominance they'd felt slipping away. Scarface leaned back in his seat, watching Jack with a smirk that didn't quite reach his eyes. "You know," he said, his voice carrying across the room, "I don't think I've ever seen a guy so eager to get himself hurt." Jack didn't respond. He set his coffee cup down and reached for the small plate of toast in front of him. Scarface's smirk widened. "What's the matter, old man? Cat got your tongue?" The blonde biker laughed, nudging the wiry guy beside him. "Maybe he's waiting for us to invite him over." The tattooed man snorted. "Yeah, right. He'd probably have a heart attack trying to keep up." Their laughter filled the room, but it didn't last long. Jack took another bite of his toast, then wiped his hands on a napkin. His movements were slow, deliberate, almost methodical. When he finally spoke, his voice was calm but carried an edge that cut through the noise like a knife. "If you're done talking," he said, "you might want to think about finishing your meal and heading out." The bikers froze. For a moment, no one said anything. Then Scarface leaned forward, his grin returning with a hint of malice. "Or what?" he asked, his tone mocking. Jack didn't answer. He didn't need to. The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Scarface pushed his chair back and stood, his movements slow and deliberate. "All right, old man," he said, cracking his knuckles. "Let's see what you've got." The air in the cafe thickened as the bikers made their presence known. Their boots stomped against the scuffed tile, each step resonating like the ticking of a bomb. The scent of motor oil, stale beer, and sweat trailed behind them, curling into every corner of the small room. Jack didn't look up. His coffee, now lukewarm, occupied his attention as he stirred a lazy swirl into the dark liquid. He moved slowly, deliberately, as though the chaos they brought in had no bearing on his world. "Hey, old man," barked the wiry biker with a scar slicing across his cheek, his voice a mix of mockery and menace. He let the door slam shut behind him, the sound echoing in the sudden silence. "You gonna move, or do we have to teach you some manners?" The cashier, Emma, froze, her phone slipping slightly in her trembling hands. The cook in the back peeked around the corner, his head disappearing again as quickly as it had appeared. The couple in the corner booth huddled closer, exchanging worried glances but saying nothing. Jack didn't flinch. He stirred his coffee one more time, then set the spoon down with a soft clink. Reaching for the sugar, he poured a measured packet into the cup and resumed stirring. Scarface smirked, his crooked teeth glinting under the dim light. "Oh, he's a tough guy, huh?" he sneered, turning to his crew for approval. "Guess he's too busy with his afternoon tea party to answer us." The others laughed, the sound harsh and unkind. It wasn't the type of laughter that came from real humor, it was the kind meant to unsettle, to establish dominance. Scarface grabbed a chair and dragged it across the floor, the metal legs screeching loudly. He planted himself directly across from Jack, leaning forward with his elbows on the table. "Tell me something, Grandpa," he said, his tone dripping with mockery. "What makes you think you can sit here like you own the place?" Jack finally looked up. His gaze was steady, his expression unreadable. The lines on his face didn't deepen with tension or anger, instead, they seemed etched with patience, like a weathered rock that had endured 1,000 storms. "Just trying to enjoy my coffee," he said simply. That calm, those 4 plain words, landed with the weight of a hammer. Scarface's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second before he caught himself. His companions exchanged glances, unsure whether to laugh or wait for his lead. "Well," Scarface said, recovering his bravado, "you're gonna need something a hell of a lot stronger when we're done here." He leaned back in his chair, spreading his arms wide as if declaring his dominion over the room. Jack returned his attention to his cup, lifting it to his lips for a slow sip. He didn't rush. He didn't acknowledge the implied threat. He simply sipped, set the cup down, and folded his hands neatly on the table. The lack of reaction was like a match striking against Scarface's ego. He leaned forward again, slamming his palm on the table. The couple in the corner flinched, and Emma gasped audibly, her hands flying to her mouth. "What's the matter, old man?" Scarface demanded, his voice rising. "Too scared to say something?" Jack's gaze flicked to the man's hand on the table, then back to his face. His tone didn't rise or waver. "I've already said enough." The simplicity of the response seemed to unnerve Scarface, but he covered it with an exaggerated laugh. "Oh, you've got guts, I'll give you that." He turned to his crew. "The old guy thinks he's Clint Eastwood or something." The blonde biker chuckled nervously, but the tattooed one didn't laugh. His eyes narrowed, flicking between Jack and Scarface. "Maybe we ought to leave him alone, man," he muttered, but Scarface waved him off. "Nah, he's just a washed-up geezer," Scarface said, standing abruptly. "Let's see how tough he really is." He reached for Jack's coffee cup, intending to spill it, but before his fingers made contact, Jack's hand shot out, gripping Scarface's wrist. The movement was so fast it caught everyone off guard. The room fell silent, the faint hum of the ceiling fan suddenly deafening. Scarface stared down at Jack's hand, his mouth half open in disbelief. The grip wasn't overly tight, but it was firm, unshakable. Jack's fingers seemed to clamp down like steel, holding him in place with minimal effort. "You've made your point," Jack said evenly, his voice calm but carrying an edge that cut through the tension like a blade. "You don't want to make another?" For a moment, Scarface didn't move. He couldn't. His companions stared, their bravado crumbling as unease seeped into their expressions. Then Scarface yanked his hand back, stumbling slightly as he retreated. He cradled his wrist, glaring at Jack with a mixture of anger and confusion. "You're gonna regret that, old man," he snarled, but there was no conviction in his voice. Jack didn't respond. He picked up his coffee again, taking another measured sip as though nothing had happened. The tattooed biker stood, his bulk casting a shadow over the table. "Kman, Scar," he muttered. "This guy's not worth it." Scarface hesitated, his pride warring with his instincts. Finally, he spat on the floor and motioned for his crew to follow. "Let's get out of this dump," he snapped, his voice hollow. The bikers shuffled out, their earlier swagger noticeably diminished. Scarface was the last to leave, casting one last venomous glance over his shoulder before slamming the door behind him. The cafe seemed to exhale as they roared away, their motorcycles kicking up dust in the parking lot. Emma leaned heavily against the counter, her face pale. The couple in the corner whispered to each other, relief evident in their expressions. Jack finished his coffee, placed a few bills on the counter, and stood. His movements were calm, unhurried, as though nothing unusual had happened. "Thank you," Emma said softly as he walked past her. Jack nodded but didn't reply. He stepped outside, the sun casting long shadows across the cracked asphalt. He didn't watch the bikers disappear down the road. Instead, he climbed into his old pickup truck, started the engine, and pulled out onto the highway. Back in the cafe, Emma watched him go, a question lingering in her mind that she couldn't quite bring herself to ask. Who was he? Jack Carver wasn't just a quiet man passing through. The calm he displayed wasn't born from ignorance or naivete. It came from experience that, for better or worse, had left its mark on him. As the cafe settled back into its routine, no one realized the bikers wouldn't forget this encounter anytime soon. And neither would Jack. Jack had barely left the parking lot when the bikers came roaring back into the cafe. Their motorcycles screamed as they skidded to a halt, gravel crunching and spitting under their wheels. The door slammed open, and Scarface led the charge, his face flushed with anger. "I'm not done with him," Scarface growled, his voice low and dangerous. He scanned the room, his eyes narrowing when he realized Jack was gone. Emma froze behind the counter, clutching the edge as if it might shield her. The other patrons exchanged uneasy glances but stayed silent, their heads down. The tattooed biker stepped forward cautiously. "He's not here, man. Let it go." Scarface spun around, his glare sharp enough to cut. "You telling me what to do now, Inc?" Inc raised his hands in a placating gesture. "I'm just saying, guy like that, something's off. Didn't feel right, you know. Didn't feel right." Scarface mocked, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "What are you, psychic now? He was just some washed-up old man with a big mouth." Inc didn't respond, but his silence spoke volumes. Scarface's bravado had been shaken earlier, and now the cracks were beginning to show. Emma cleared her throat, drawing their attention. Her voice trembled, but she forced herself to speak. "Look, he paid for his coffee and left. He's probably miles down the road by now." Scarface's eyes snapped to her, his smirk returning with a cruel twist. "Oh, so now you're his little helper, huh?" Emma took a step back, her heart pounding. I am just telling the truth," she stammered. The blonde biker chuckled, nudging Inc. "She's got guts, I'll give her that." Scarface wasn't amused. He stalked toward the counter, his boots pounding against the floor. Emma shrank back, but there was nowhere to go. "You think this is funny?" Scarface hissed, leaning over the counter. "You think I'm gonna let some punk waitress talk down to me?" Emma's voice caught in her throat. She wanted to scream, to call for help, but the words wouldn't come. Then, just as Scarface reached for her, the sound of an engine rumbled outside. It wasn't the high-pitched whine of a motorcycle, it was a deep, steady growl. Scarface paused, his hand hovering in the air. He turned slowly toward the door as the engine grew louder, closer. The other bikers exchanged uneasy glances. Even the cook, who had been hiding in the back, peeked around the corner, his eyes wide with curiosity. The sound stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. For a moment, all anyone could hear was the faint hum of the ceiling fan and the rapid thudding of Emma's heart. The door creaked open, and Jack Carver stepped inside. He didn't look like much had changed since he left. His leather jacket was still worn, his salt and pepper hair still tousled from the wind. But there was something in his eyes, something sharp and unyielding that made the bikers freeze in place. Scarface's bravado wavered, but he quickly covered it with a sneer. Well, look who decided to come back. Couldn't get enough of us, old man." Jack didn't respond immediately. He took his time walking to the counter, his boots clicking softly against the tile. He placed his hands on the counter and looked at Emma. "You all right?" he asked quietly. Emma nodded, her eyes wide with a mix of relief and fear. Jack turned his attention to Scarface, his expression unreadable. "I thought I told you to leave," he said evenly. Scarface bristled, his fists clenching at his sides. "You don't get to tell me what to do," he snapped. Jack tilted his head slightly, as if considering the statement. "No," he said after a moment. "But I can make you regret staying." The room seemed to hold its breath. The bikers exchanged uneasy glances, their earlier bravado draining away. Scarface laughed, but it was forced, hollow. "Big talk for an old man," he said, taking a step forward. "You think you can take all of us?" Jack's gaze didn't waver. "If I have to." For a moment, Scarface hesitated. Then he snarled and lunged at Jack, his fists swinging wildly. Jack moved with a speed and precision that defied his age. He sidestepped the punch easily, grabbing Scarface's arm and twisting it behind his back in one fluid motion. Scarface cried out, the sound raw and full of disbelief. The other bikers scrambled to their feet, but Jack's voice cut through the chaos like a whip. "Don't." Something in his tone stopped them in their tracks. It wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that demanded obedience. "Let him go, old man," Ink said, his voice shaking. "We don't want any trouble." Jack released Scarface, who stumbled forward and clutched his arm, glaring at Jack with a mixture of anger and humiliation. "You've already found trouble," Jack said, his voice calm but firm. "Now it's up to you how bad it gets." Scarface straightened, his face red with rage. "You think you're some kind of hero," he spat. "You think you can just walk in here and—" Jack stepped forward, cutting him off mid-sentence. The movement was subtle, but it carried an undeniable authority. "Leave," he said simply. For a moment, no one moved. Then Ink grabbed Scarface's shoulder, pulling him back. "Let's go," he muttered. Scarface resisted for a moment, his pride warring with his survival instincts. Finally, he relented, shrugging Ink off and stalking toward the door. "This isn't over," he snarled over his shoulder. Jack watched them leave, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. He waited until the roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance before turning back to Emma. "You okay?" he asked again. Emma nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "Thank you," she whispered. Jack nodded once, then turned and walked out the door without another word. The cafe was quiet again, but the tension lingered like smoke after a fire. Emma and the other patrons exchanged glances, the same unspoken question hanging in the air: who was Jack Carver? None of them could have known that the answer to that question would soon become impossible to ignore. Scarface scowled, shaking off the flicker of doubt that crept into his mind. "Big words for a man sitting all alone," he sneered. "Let me guess you're one of those old tough guys who used to play soldier." Think you can scare us with some story about how you took down bad guys back in the day? The blonde biker chimed in, laughing nervously. Yeah, maybe he's writing a book about it. The adventures of a washed-up has-been. The group burst into laughter, but their amusement didn't last long. Jack's smirk faded, replaced by a blank expression that somehow felt more threatening than anger. He finally lifted his coffee cup, taking a slow sip as if he had all the time in the world. Then, setting the cup down carefully, he spoke. You boys ever hear of a man named Redback? Jack's voice was low, almost conversational, but it carried through the cafe like a warning. The bikers stopped laughing. They exchanged uneasy glances. Scarface crossed his arms, trying to regain control of the moment. What kind of stupid question is that? What's it to you? Jack's eyes locked onto Scarface's, unblinking. Redback used to run a crew like yours. Big, loud, thought they owned every road they rode on. He was trouble until he crossed paths with someone who wasn't afraid of him. Scarface leaned forward, his lip curling into a snarl. Yeah? And what happened to him? Jack didn't blink. He learned the hard way that it's not how loud you are that makes you dangerous. It's what you can do when it matters. The room went silent again, the weight of Jack's words settling over the bikers. For the first time, the younger ones started to shift uncomfortably. They glanced at each other, looking for someone to break the tension. Scarface wasn't ready to back down. He slapped his hand on the counter, his voice rising. You think you're gonna scare us with some campfire story? We don't care about your made-up past, old man. Jack's gaze didn't waver. He reached into his pocket slowly, deliberately, and pulled out a worn leather wallet. He opened it and slid something onto the counter, a small, tarnished badge with faded lettering. The kind of badge that spoke louder than any story. The bikers leaned in, their bravado slipping. Ink was the first to recognize it. His face paled as he whispered, "That's military. Special Forces." The blonde biker snorted nervously, trying to laugh it off. So what? Lots of old guys were in the military. But Scarface didn't move. His eyes were locked on the badge, and his smirk faltered. Special Forces don't carry those unless, he trailed off, unwilling to finish the sentence. Jack picked up the badge and slid it back into his wallet. You're right, he said quietly. Lots of old guys were in the military. But not all of them were trained to hunt down people who thought they were untouchable. Ink took a step back, muttering under his breath. I told you something was off about him. Scarface rounded on him, his temper flaring. Shut up, Ink. He's just playing games with us. He's nothing. But Scarface's voice lacked its earlier conviction, and Jack noticed. He stood slowly, his full height commanding attention even without a threatening posture. The bikers instinctively stepped back, their confidence unraveling. You boys should leave, Jack said, his tone calm but firm. You don't want to see what happens if you don't. Scarface clenched his fists, his pride battling against the growing fear in his gut. You think you're better than us? Huh. Just 'cause you've got some old badge and a scary voice. Jack stepped forward, his movements deliberate. The air seemed to thicken as he closed the distance between them. He stopped just inches from Scarface, his gaze unwavering. Better than you. Jack's voice dropped to a near whisper, and yet every word hit like a hammer. No. I've just seen things you can't even imagine. And I know how to end trouble before it starts. Scarface froze, his bravado crumbling under the weight of Jack's presence. The other bikers stood rooted in place, unsure whether to intervene or run. Then, almost imperceptibly, Jack's stance shifted. It was subtle, a slight adjustment of his weight, a tightening of his jaw, but it spoke volumes. Scarface saw it, and for the first time, he realized just how dangerous this quiet man might be. The door creaked open, breaking the tension like a knife slicing through fabric. Everyone turned to see Emma standing there, her face pale but determined. "Leave him alone," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You've done enough." Scarface sneered, finding a shred of his courage in the distraction. "You don't get to tell us what to do, little girl." But Jack raised a hand, stopping Emma before she could respond. "It's okay," he said softly. "They're leaving." The certainty in his voice left no room for argument. Even Scarface hesitated, the challenge dying in his throat. He glanced at his crew, searching for support, but found only unease in their eyes. Finally, Scarface spat on the floor, a final act of defiance. "This ain't over, old man," he muttered, turning on his heel. The bikers followed him out, their boots clomping against the tile. The roar of their motorcycles faded into the distance, leaving the cafe eerily quiet. Jack sat back down, picking up his coffee as if nothing had happened. Emma approached cautiously, her hands shaking. Are you okay?" Jack looked up at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "I'm fine." She hesitated, then asked the question that had been on everyone's mind. "Who are you?" Jack didn't answer right away. He took another sip of his coffee, his gaze distant. Finally, he said, "Just someone who knows how to deal with bullies." Emma wanted to press for more, but something in his tone told her not to. Instead, she nodded and walked back behind the counter, her thoughts racing. Jack glanced out the window, watching the empty road. He knew the bikers weren't done. They'd be back, angrier and more dangerous. And when they came, they'd learn just how much trouble they'd stumbled into. The cafe settled into an uneasy silence after the bikers left. Emma returned to her place behind the counter, her trembling hands busying themselves with an already clean coffee pot. The few other patrons whispered among themselves, stealing glances at Jack as if he might explode into action again at any moment. Jack, for his part, appeared utterly calm. He leaned back on his stool, finished his coffee in one slow sip, and placed the empty cup neatly on the counter. But his eyes, sharp and calculating, never stopped scanning the room and the parking lot beyond the window. Emma mustered the courage to approach him again. "That was incredible," she said, her voice low. "But those guys, what if they come back?" Jack met her gaze, his expression unreadable. "They will," he said simply. The certainty in his tone sent a chill down her spine. "You should call the police or something," she suggested, though even she didn't sound convinced. In a place like this, the law didn't always respond quickly if at all. Jack shook his head. "It's better if they don't get involved." Emma frowned, puzzled. "Why not?" "Those guys are dangerous. You can't handle them all by yourself." Jack smiled faintly, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Sometimes calling for help makes things worse. Trust me, I've seen it happen." Emma opened her mouth to protest but closed it again. There was something about the way Jack spoke like he'd lived through things she couldn't begin to imagine. She wanted to ask more questions, but the sound of a faint rumble outside stopped her. Jack's posture changed instantly. He sat up straighter, his head turning toward the window like a predator catching the scent of prey. The rumble grew louder, unmistakably the sound of motorcycles. They were coming back. Emma's eyes widened in fear. "Oh no. What are we gonna do?" Jack stood, his movements deliberate. He adjusted his jacket, pulling it snug around his shoulders, and turned to Emma. "Lock the doors. Tell everyone to stay inside." Emma hesitated, but the steel in his gaze left no room for argument. She scrambled to the door, flipping the lock and motioning for the patrons to stay put. They huddled together in the far corner, their murmurs filled with panic. Jack stepped toward the window, peering out. The bikers had returned, but this time there were more of them, 7, maybe 8. Their engines growled as they pulled into the lot, forming a loose semicircle around the entrance. Scarface dismounted first, his face twisted into a malicious grin. Jack turned back to Emma. "Do you have a back door?" She nodded quickly. "Yeah, but it leads to the alley. There's no way out from there except..." Jack cut her off with a raised hand. "Good. Keep everyone here. Don't open the door for anyone but me." Emma stared at him, her fear mounting. "What are you gonna do?" Jack didn't answer. Instead, he walked to the door, unlocked it, and stepped outside before anyone could stop him. The cool air hit Jack's face as he closed the door behind him. The bikers stared at him, their smirks and laughter barely hiding the tension that hung between them. Scarface stepped forward, his swagger exaggerated, his hands resting on his belt like a gunslinger. "Look who decided to come out and play," Scarface taunted. "You ready for round 2, old man?" Jack walked slowly toward them, his boots crunching on the gravel. He stopped a few paces away, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. "You boys made a mistake coming back." Scarface laughed, though it sounded forced. "You think you're some kind of big deal, huh? Flashing that badge like it means something." Jack's gaze swept over the group, taking in every detail: the placement of their bikes, the tension in their stances, the weapons some of them carried openly. He locked eyes with Scarface. "It doesn't mean anything. Not to you. But what I can do that might." The laughter died. One of the younger bikers, a stocky man with a chain wrapped around his fist, shifted uncomfortably. "Why don't we just leave, Scar? This guy's not worth it." Scarface rounded on him, his anger flaring. "Shut up. We don't run from nobodies." Jack took a step closer, his calm demeanor like a storm waiting to break. "You should listen to your friend," he said. "This doesn't have to end badly." Scarface sneered, pulling a knife from his pocket and flipping it open. "You don't get to decide how this ends." The other bikers tensed, their hands drifting toward weapons or clenched into fists. Jack stood his ground, his expression unchanged. "You're right," Jack said evenly. "But I can promise you one thing: if you make the wrong move, none of you are walking out of here the same." The tension snapped like a rubber band. Scarface lunged forward, slashing with the knife. Jack sidestepped effortlessly, his hand shooting out to grab Scarface's wrist. In one swift motion, he twisted, forcing Scarface to drop the knife with a yelp of pain. The other bikers surged forward, but Jack moved like lightning. He swept Scarface's legs out from under him and used him as a shield, backing away while holding him in a tight grip. "Stop," Jack commanded, his voice like thunder. "Think about what you're doing." For a moment, the bikers froze. Their leader was pinned, his face contorted in pain. But the blonde biker wasn't ready to back down. He raised a length of pipe, charging at Jack with a roar. Jack released Scarface, stepping aside just in time. The blonde swung wildly, but Jack ducked and drove an elbow into his ribs. The biker collapsed, gasping for air. The others hesitated again, their confidence wavering. Jack straightened, his eyes scanning them with a look that made it clear he was far from done. "You came here looking for trouble," Jack said, his voice steady. "Now you've found it?" Scarface struggled to his feet, clutching his wrist. His bravado was gone, replaced by fear and anger. You're dead. You hear me? Dead." Jack didn't respond. He simply stood there, waiting. Scarface hesitated, then barked at his crew. "Get him." The bikers charged as a group, but Jack was ready. He moved with precision, using their own momentum against them. A sidestep here, a sharp jab there. Within moments, two more were on the ground, groaning in pain. The fight wasn't over, but it was clear that Jack wasn't just some old man. He was something else entirely, something the bikers hadn't counted on. Inside the cafe, Emma and the patrons watched through the window, their fear mingling with awe. "Who is he?" someone whispered. Emma shook her head, her eyes glued to the scene outside. "I don't know," she said softly. "But I think we're about to find out." The cafe's air thickened as tension reached its breaking point. Scarface groaned, clutching his wrist, now bent at an unnatural angle. Jack released him, stepping back with calculated ease. His movements were deliberate, each one radiating control, experience, and an unmistakable sense of danger. The remaining bikers hesitated, their confidence cracking like brittle glass. They exchanged uncertain glances, silently daring one another to be the next to step forward. "What's the matter?" Jack said, his voice calm but laced with an edge that made the hair on their necks stand up. "Not so brave now." Blondie, still clutching the pipe from earlier, finally worked up his courage. With a roar, he charged at Jack, swinging the weapon wildly. Jack didn't flinch. Instead, he sidestepped the attack with a grace that seemed almost effortless. Before Blondie could recover, Jack delivered a precise blow to his ribs, sending him sprawling to the ground. "That's two," Jack said evenly, his eyes sweeping over the rest of the group. "Who's next?" Scarface, still cradling his wrist, growled through gritted teeth. "You don't know who you're messing with, old man. We run this town." Jack's lips curled into a faint smirk. "You run from this town," he corrected, taking another step forward. "Or you won't be running at all." One of the younger bikers, a wiry kid with a nervous twitch, stammered, Who are you? You're not just some guy drinking coffee. What's your deal?" Jack's eyes locked onto the kid, and for the first time, there was something behind his calm gaze, something cold and unyielding. "My deal," he repeated. "Let's just say I've spent a lifetime dealing with people like you." He pulled back his jacket slightly, enough for everyone to see the faded patch more clearly, a dagger crossed with lightning bolts, the unmistakable emblem of a retired Special Forces operative. "Green Beret," Jack said, his voice low but carrying enough weight to silence the room. 3 tours overseas, 20 years in the field, and 10 more training people who were better than you'll ever be. The bikers stared, their tough exteriors crumbling under the weight of this revelation. The room seemed smaller now, the walls closing in on their bravado. Scarface tried to mask his fear with anger. "So what? You're retired. Probably slow. We've got the numbers." Jack's smirk deepened. "Numbers don't mean anything when you don't know how to use them." Another biker, this one stocky with a tattoo snaking up his neck, decided to test Jack's words. He lunged forward with a chain wrapped around his fist. But Jack was ready. In a blur of motion, he grabbed the man's arm, twisted it behind his back, and swept his legs out from under him. The chain clattered to the floor as the man hit the ground with a grunt. 3, Jack said, his voice as steady as ever. The rest of the gang took a collective step back, their confidence completely shattered. Blondie struggled to his feet, only to wobble and collapse again, clutching his ribs. Scarface's eyes darted toward the door. His swagger was gone, replaced by a desperate need to escape. "You're crazy," he spat. "This isn't over." Jack stepped closer, his shadow looming over the cowering leader. "Oh, it's over," he said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. "You just don't know it yet." Scarface scrambled backward, his boots scraping against the tile floor. "Let's go," he shouted to the others, his voice cracking. "Get to the bikes." The bikers didn't need to be told twice. They bolted for the door, dragging their injured comrades with them. Engines roared to life in the parking lot as they made their retreat, leaving behind a trail of dust and their shattered egos. Jack watched them go, his expression unreadable. When the last bike disappeared down the road, he turned back to the cafe. The patrons stared at him, wide-eyed and slack-jawed. Emma stood frozen behind the counter, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were white. Finally, she found her voice. "What just happened?" Jack walked back to the counter, picking up his coffee cup and examining it like nothing unusual had occurred. "Just teaching some manners," he said, setting the cup down with a soft clink. Emma blinked. "Teaching manners? Jack, you just took down half a biker gang like it was nothing." Jack shrugged, his expression as neutral as ever. "They'll think twice before causing trouble again." One of the older patrons, a man who'd been sitting silently in the corner the whole time, spoke up. "That patch on your jacket," he said, his voice filled with awe. "You're not just a soldier, are you?" Jack glanced at him, then at the rest of the room. For a moment, he seemed to consider explaining further, but instead, he simply said, "Used to be." Emma stepped closer, her fear replaced by curiosity. "Why didn't you tell anyone? Why live here, in the middle of nowhere?" Jack met her gaze, his eyes carrying the weight of decades of experiences he would never put into words. "Because sometimes, when you've seen enough, you just want some peace and quiet." The room fell silent again, but this time, it wasn't out of fear. It was respect. Jack reached into his pocket, pulled out a few bills, and placed them on the counter. "Thanks for the coffee," he said with a small nod. "You make a good cup." And with that, he turned and walked out, his boots echoing on the tile floor. The door swung shut behind him, leaving the cafe to buzz with whispered speculation and lingering awe. Out in the parking lot, Jack paused, looking down the empty road where the bikers had fled. A faint smirk played on his lips before he climbed onto his own motorcycle, a sleek, black machine that gleamed in the sunlight. The engine roared to life, and Jack sped off into the distance, leaving nothing behind but the memory of the man who had turned a roadside cafe into a battlefield and won. Jack's motorcycle hummed steadily as it carved through the winding back roads. The vast expanse of open land stretched before him, painted in hues of orange and gold as the sun began its descent. The solitude of the road was a stark contrast to the chaos he had left behind at the cafe. Yet, for Jack, it wasn't chaos, it was just another day. He couldn't help but think back to the moment he'd revealed his insignia. The look on Scarface's face had been almost comical, a mix of fear and disbelief. Jack knew the type well, bullies who thrived on intimidation, who folded like a deck of cards when confronted by someone who didn't flinch. And Jack never flinched. The road ahead blurred slightly as his mind wandered further. He had spent decades honing his skills, living in a world where hesitation could mean death. The missions, the battles, the scars, they were all part of him, etched into his very being. Retirement hadn't erased them, it had simply given him the space to breathe. But moments like today reminded him that the instincts never really left. Jack pulled off onto a scenic overlook, parking his bike on the gravel shoulder. He stepped off, taking a deep breath of the cool evening air. The quietness here was what he lived for now, no commands barking in his ear, no plans to execute, just the sound of the wind and the occasional rustle of leaves. He stared out at the horizon, the sun dipping lower, casting long shadows over the landscape. The sound of another engine broke his reverie. Jack turned his head slightly, his body tensing out of habit. A beat-up pickup truck rolled to a stop a few yards away. The door creaked open, and a man stepped out. It was the older patron from the cafe, the one who had recognized Jack's patch. "Thought I might find you here," the man said, his voice carrying a note of respect. He approached slowly, hands visible, a gesture Jack appreciated. Jack's stance relaxed slightly, though his sharp gaze didn't waver. "Something I can help you with?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "No, just wanted to say thanks. Those boys have been causing trouble around here for months. Local law doesn't seem to scare them much, but you," he let out a low whistle. "You sent 'em running like rabbits." Jack didn't reply immediately. He turned his eyes back to the horizon, his expression unreadable. "They'll be back," he said after a moment. "People like that don't learn their lesson overnight." The man nodded, stepping up beside Jack. "Maybe. But at least now they know this place isn't theirs to run. That's more than anyone else has managed." Jack shrugged, his leather jacket creaking softly with the motion. "They'll find someone else to push around. Bullies always do." The man studied him for a moment, his weathered face thoughtful. "You don't give yourself enough credit. I saw how you handled them, calm, measured. You didn't just fight them, you made a point. You showed everyone in that cafe what real strength looks like." Jack let the words hang in the air. Compliments like that didn't sit well with him, they never had. Strength wasn't something he flaunted, it was something he used when necessary, a tool he wielded with care. But he couldn't deny the man had a point. The other patrons had watched, wide-eyed, as Jack dismantled the biker's bravado piece by piece. Maybe, in some small way, he had made a difference. The man seemed to sense Jack's discomfort and changed the subject. "You know, back in the day, I served too. Not special forces like you, but a tour's a tour. Gets in your blood, doesn't it?" Jack glanced at him, a faint flicker of understanding in his eyes. "Yeah," he said simply. "It does." The two men stood in silence for a while, watching as the sun sank below the horizon. Finally, the older man clapped Jack on the shoulder, a brief, firm gesture of camaraderie. "Well, I won't keep you. Just wanted to say my piece. You take care, Jack." Jack inclined his head, watching as the man climbed back into his truck and drove off. Alone again, he leaned against his bike, his thoughts swirling like the breeze around him. The cafe had been a momentary blip in his quiet life, a reminder of the man he used to be. But Jack knew better than to dwell on it. Tomorrow, the world would keep turning. The bikers would lick their wounds, the cafe would open its doors again, and Jack would move on, 1 mile of open road at a time. Still, as he climbed back onto his bike and revved the engine, he couldn't shake the feeling that the encounter wasn't over. He had made a statement today, a loud, undeniable statement. And if there was one thing Jack Carver had learned in his years of service, it was this: every action had consequences. As the night enveloped the landscape, Jack disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind a trail of unanswered questions and a legacy of quiet strength that no one at that cafe would soon forget. The cafe buzzed with a nervous energy as Jack's words settled over the room. The cashier stared at him like he'd just walked out of a movie. The cook, who had peeked through the service window during the chaos, wiped his hands on his apron and ventured out, his curiosity too strong to contain. "Military, huh?" the cook said, his voice rough but tinged with respect. "What branch?" Jack didn't look up from his coffee. "Special Forces." The cook let out a low whistle. "Well, that explains it. Those punks didn't stand a chance." Jack didn't respond. He lifted his cup, finishing the last sip of coffee before setting it down gently. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional scrape of a chair as someone shifted uncomfortably. The other patrons avoided eye contact, still processing what they just witnessed. Emma, the young cashier, leaned against the counter, her hands shaking slightly. You didn't have to do that, you know. They could have hurt you." Jack finally looked at her, his eyes calm but piercing. "They weren't going to hurt anyone," he said simply. Emma frowned. "How can you be so sure?" Jack's gaze softened, just a little. "Because bullies like that only have power when people are afraid of them. Take away their fear, and they've got nothing." The cook nodded, folding his arms. "Well, you sure showed them. Bet they won't be coming back anytime soon." Jack gave a small shrug, his expression unreadable. "Maybe. Maybe not. What do you mean? Emma asked. Jack glanced out the window, his sharp eyes scanning the empty parking lot. People like that don't learn overnight. They'll either find someone else to bother, or they'll try to come back here and prove something. That's why you all need to stand together. Fear is what keeps them in control. Take that away, and they've got no reason to stick around. The cook scratched his head, considering Jack's words. You're saying we need to fight back? Jack shook his head. Not fight. Stand. There's a difference. The room fell quiet again, the weight of Jack's words sinking in. One of the older patrons, a woman in her 60s with a no-nonsense demeanor, spoke up from her booth. He's right. We've been putting up with those thugs for too long. They've been running this area like they own it, and we've just been letting them. Another man, sitting at the counter, nodded. But what can we do? Most of us aren't trained like he is. We're just regular people. Jack leaned back in his chair, his demeanor as calm as ever. You don't need to be trained to stand up for yourselves. All it takes is unity. They rely on people staying quiet, looking the other way. You take that away, and they've got nothing. Emma bit her lip, her hands fidgeting with the edge of her apron. What if they come back? Jack studied her for a moment, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, weathered notebook. He tore out a page, scribbled something on it, and slid it across the counter to her. If they come back, call this number, he said. It's a friend of mine, local law enforcement. Tell them what happened, and they'll take care of it. Emma picked up the paper, staring at the number like it was a lifeline. Thank you, she said softly. Jack nodded, standing up and sliding a few bills onto the counter to pay for his coffee. One more thing, he said, looking around the room. Don't let them see you scared. Fear gives them power. Take that away, and they're just a bunch of guys pretending to be tough. With that, he adjusted his jacket and headed for the door. The cafe was still as everyone watched him leave. The bell above the door jingled softly as it swung shut behind him. Outside, the cool evening air greeted Jack as he walked to his bike. He swung a leg over the sleek black machine, the leather of his jacket creaking softly. He paused for a moment, looking back at the cafe. Through the window, he could see the patrons talking, their postures more upright, their expressions more determined. A faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He revved the engine, the deep growl of the bike cutting through the quiet night. As he pulled out of the parking lot, the headlights illuminated the long stretch of road ahead. Jack knew the bikers might come back, but he also knew the people in that cafe were stronger than they realized. And if they ever needed help, well, he wasn't hard to find. The night swallowed him as he rode off, the stars above twinkling like a promise. Justice had been served, but more importantly, a seed of courage had been planted. Jack Carver didn't need thanks or recognition. The open road was his home now, and his mission was simple, to leave every place a little better than he found it. Back in the cafe, Emma folded the piece of paper Jack had given her and tucked it into her pocket. She looked out the window, the sound of Jack's motorcycle fading into the distance. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of hope. And for the first time in years, the cafe felt like a place worth fighting for. As Jack's motorcycle faded into the distance, the silence in the cafe deepened. It wasn't the kind of silence that felt empty, but one filled with the weight of everything that had just happened. The bikers were gone. The tension had been lifted. And, for the first time in a long while, the people in that small cafe began to breathe a little easier. Emma, the young cashier, stood still behind the counter, her eyes fixed on the door that Jack had just exited. His words still echoed in her mind. Bullies don't know what they're up against until it's too late. She had never seen anyone stand up to people like that, let alone take them down so effortlessly. It wasn't just about physical strength. It was something deeper, something almost invisible in the way Jack carried himself. For the first time, Emma felt a sense of pride swell in her chest. She wasn't sure why, but the courage Jack had shown had somehow ignited a spark inside her. She looked around at the patrons, some of them still processing, others lost in their own thoughts. It was as if Jack had changed something in them, too. In the way they sat. In the way they looked at each other. The cook, who had been quiet for most of the exchange, finally spoke up. "That guy, he wasn't just some retired soldier. There's more to him. You saw how he handled those bikers. Calm, like he'd done it 100 times before." Emma nodded slowly, her thoughts still racing. "Yeah. He was in control the whole time. Didn't let them intimidate him for a second." "Exactly," the cook agreed, shaking his head. "And I think that's the real lesson here. Not that we should all go pick fights, but that, when it comes down to it, knowing your worth and standing firm can make all the difference. The moment you let someone push you around is the moment you lose." Emma watched him for a moment, her eyes thoughtful. She hadn't seen it that way before. The idea of standing firm. Of knowing your own strength. She had always been the quiet one, the one who kept her head down, who avoided confrontation. But now, something in Jack's calm confidence was stirring something new inside her. She didn't need to be loud to be strong. She didn't need to fight to be powerful. She only needed to believe in herself, to stand her ground when it mattered most. And that wasn't just about facing down bikers in a cafe. It was about standing up to any form of fear, injustice, or disrespect. It was about standing tall, even when the world tried to knock you down. The older woman who had spoken up earlier, one of the regulars, smiled as she looked at Emma. "You know, I've been coming here for years, but I've never seen anything like that. It's like he reminded us that we have power, even when we feel small." Emma met her gaze, and for the first time, she felt like she could truly understand what the woman meant. She wasn't sure how long it would take for everything to fully sink in, but one thing was clear: she wasn't the same person who had walked into this cafe a few hours ago. Jack had reminded them all of something powerful that day. That it wasn't always the loudest voice that made the difference, but the quietest one, the one that could stand, unmoved, in the face of danger. The one that didn't need to prove anything but still commanded respect. The door jingled again, and another customer walked in, a man who had been sitting outside his truck when the commotion had started. He glanced around at the now calm cafe, his eyes lingering on the empty spot where Jack had been sitting just moments ago. He didn't say anything at first. He just nodded his head in acknowledgement, as if he knew something had shifted in the air. Emma gave him a small smile, her voice steady and more confident than she had ever sounded. "Hey, the usual." The man nodded, and she began to prepare his coffee, a little quicker than before. She found that her hands weren't shaking anymore. They were steady, and she didn't feel the need to avoid looking people in the eye. The cafe wasn't just a place where people stopped for a cup of coffee anymore. It was a place where something had been awakened. Where people who had been walking through life with their heads down now knew they had a choice. Outside, Jack's motorcycle had long disappeared from view. The road stretched out before him, but it wasn't just about the road anymore. He had done more than just stand up to a group of bikers. He had shown them all how to stand firm, to hold their ground in the face of adversity. As he continued down the road, the evening air cool against his face, Jack couldn't help but reflect on the brief encounter. He'd learned long ago that there were battles worth fighting and others best left behind. But sometimes, the simplest acts of standing tall in the face of fear left the greatest mark. In that little cafe, Jack had done something more than defend himself. He had shown everyone who witnessed it that courage didn't have to come with a fight. It came from within, from the quiet assurance that you were enough just as you were. And that no one, no matter how loud or threatening, could take that away from you unless you let them. The road ahead was long, but Jack knew one thing for certain: the world was full of small battles, of people who just needed a little reminder that they weren't alone in their struggles. And maybe, just maybe, the world needed more quiet warriors who knew how to stand up, not for recognition or glory, but simply because it was the right thing to do. In the cafe, Emma stood a little straighter as she set the coffee in front of her customer. Her heart felt lighter than it had in days. She wasn't sure where this newfound strength would take her, but she knew one thing: from now on, she would never let fear keep her from standing up for what was right. No matter what came next, she had learned the power of standing tall, and that, in itself, was worth more than any fight. And as for Jack Carver, wherever the road took him next, he knew that his purpose wasn't just about fighting battles, it was about showing others how to face them with courage. The quietest person in the room wasn't the one who feared the loudest voice. It was the one who could stand without flinching, who could change the course of everything with nothing more than the strength of their resolve. Because sometimes, the quietest person in the room isn't just harmless, they're the one you never saw coming.